You're sitting there listening to someone explain, again, how nothing ever works out for them, and before they even finish the sentence, you already know you're going to leave that conversation feeling strangely tired, like you were assigned a role you never agreed to play. And what you can't quite explain is why their pain feels like it keeps expanding until there's no room left for anything else in the room, not even your own thoughts. And the uncomfortable part is that they don't sound dishonest. That's what makes it harder to notice, because everything they're saying feels emotionally real, but something in the pattern feels strangely familiar, almost rehearsed by life itself, like the same emotional shape repeating through different stories, different names, different situations, but somehow always landing in the same place where they are the one who is wronged, overlooked, or misunderstood. And if you stay in that space long enough, you start to realize something subtle. You are no longer reacting to events, you are reacting to a role. There is a very specific psychological shift that happens quietly in some people over time. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a decision. It begins as interpretation. A breakup wasn't just painful, it becomes proof that they are always abandoned. A criticism wasn't just feedback, it becomes evidence that nobody ever appreciates them. A delay in response isn't just timing, it becomes emotional rejection. And slowly, something changes that most people never notice from the inside. Life stops being experienced as separate moments and starts being experienced as a continuous verdict. Aaron Beck, who studied cognitive distortions, pointed out how the mind under emotional strain doesn't just think differently, it filters reality. It begins to select only what confirms its existing emotional conclusion. So if somewhere inside a person the conclusion becomes, "I am always the one who gets hurt," then the mind becomes almost aggressively efficient at collecting proof, not because it is lying, but because it is organizing experience, and organization gives comfort even when the content hurts, because unpredictability is more terrifying than pain that feels explainable. At some point, something even deeper forms underneath the thinking. The identity begins to attach itself to the pattern. It is no longer just, "This happened to me." It becomes, "This is what always happens to me." And that difference sounds small, but psychologically it changes everything. Because now the mind is not responding to events, it is protecting a story. And stories don't like contradictions. There is a moment you can sometimes witness in conversations like this where you offer a different angle, a possible interpretation, or even a simple alternative explanation, and it doesn't land as comfort. It lands as rejection. Not because your words are harsh, but because they threaten the structure that holds their emotional world together. If it's not always unfairness, then what is it? That question can feel more destabilizing than the pain itself, because the identity built around suffering often becomes the only consistent explanation for everything that feels overwhelming inside. Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness showed something quietly unsettling. When individuals are repeatedly exposed to situations where their actions seem to have no effect, they eventually stop trying, even when circumstances change. It is not that they cannot act. It is that they have learned not to expect action to matter. Now, imagine that not as a controlled experiment, but as a long emotional history. Years of relationships where efforts felt ignored, moments where speaking up didn't change outcomes, situations where vulnerability didn't lead to safety. Over time, the nervous system stops treating effort as meaningful, and instead of trying again, it begins to build an identity that explains the lack of response. I am someone things don't work out for. And strangely, that identity brings a kind of emotional order, because now everything makes sense, even if it hurts, but there is something else happening at the same time, something more subtle and harder to admit, because people around this pattern begin to respond to it in ways that unintentionally reinforce it. When someone is distressed, others naturally lean in. They offer attention, reassurance, time, emotional presence. They soften their tone, they adjust their behavior. They try to stabilize what feels unstable, and slowly, without anyone realizing it, distress becomes socially rewarded with connection. Albert Bandura's social learning theory explains how behavior is shaped not just by consequences, but by observation and response. If a certain emotional expression consistently brings closeness, then the nervous system learns that expression as a pathway to connection, not consciously, but consistently. And over time, something quiet happens. Emotional pain becomes not just something to avoid, but something that reliably brings engagement. And that changes the internal structure of behavior in ways the person does not intend. But here's where it becomes more complex, because this is not just about attention from others. It is also about relief from internal responsibility. Because if the problem is always external, always relational, always caused by others, then there is no need to sit in the more uncomfortable space of internal uncertainty. No need to ask, why do I interpret things this way? No need to explore why certain emotional patterns repeat across different environments. Victim identity, in this sense, can become a form of psychological protection, not from people, but from self-inquiry. Because self-inquiry without emotional safety can feel like losing ground rather than gaining insight. So the mind chooses the explanation that feels most stable, even if it keeps the pain alive. And over time, that explanation stops feeling like a perspective. It starts feeling like truth. You can sometimes see it in how language shifts without awareness. A single difficult experience becomes, "This always happens." A moment of conflict becomes, "People always treat me like this." A delayed reply becomes, "Nobody cares about me." The mind compresses variation into pattern and pattern into identity. And once identity is formed, it becomes defended, even unconsciously, because losing it feels like losing coherence. There is also something rarely discussed about how emotionally reinforced identities behave in relationships. They tend to create roles around them. One person becomes the one who is always hurt, and others slowly become the ones who either rescue, explain, or eventually withdraw. And none of these roles are consciously chosen. They are shaped through repetition, through emotional feedback loops that no one explicitly agrees to. At first, people try to help. They listen longer, explain more, soften more. But over time, something shifts. The conversations begin to feel circular. The same emotional conclusion appears regardless of the input. And gradually, exhaustion enters the space, not anger. Exhaustion, and that exhaustion quietly changes how present people can remain, which then reinforces the original belief. Distance becomes evidence of abandonment, and the loop continues without needing intention from anyone involved. What makes this so psychologically dense is that the person experiencing it is not faking anything. The pain is real. The emotions are real. The bodily responses are real. The issue is not authenticity of feeling. It is the structure around the feeling. Because the mind can build very stable identities out of very unstable interpretations. And once that happens, every new experience is pulled through the same filter. Even neutral moments become emotionally coded. Even silence becomes meaning. Even absence becomes story. And the story becomes heavier than the present moment itself. There is a point in this pattern where something very subtle begins to happen internally. Moments of calm can feel unfamiliar. Situations without conflict can feel uncertain. Stability can feel like something is missing rather than something is present, because the nervous system has learned intensity as normality, and anything outside that range feels unreal. So the mind unconsciously gravitates back toward emotional familiarity, even if that familiarity is painful. Not because suffering is desired, but because unpredictability is harder to hold than known pain. And this is where things become difficult to see from the outside, because people assume change is always about effort. But in these patterns, change often feels like loss before it feels like relief. Loss of explanation, loss of identity, loss of emotional certainty. And that is not something the mind easily gives up, because then the question emerges, quietly but persistently. If I am not the one who is always treated this way, then who am I in moments where nothing is wrong? And that question doesn't always feel comforting. Sometimes it feels empty, even threatening, because suffering, when repeated long enough, can become a reference point for selfhood. And letting it go doesn't just change behavior. It changes how existence is organized internally. And maybe that is why these patterns persist longer than logic expects them to. Not because people don't understand, but because understanding is not always enough to dissolve something that has become structurally emotional. And there is something else you might notice if you reflect on your own reactions to people like this. The role you start to occupy without noticing it. The listener. The stabilizer. The one who tries to reframe reality gently enough not to trigger collapse. And over time, even that role starts to feel like part of the system. which raises a question that is not comfortable but is important to sit with. If a pattern requires multiple roles to continue, then where exactly does it begin, and where does it end? And what would happen if one part of the system stopped responding in the usual way? Not with rejection, not with correction, but with a different kind of presence that does not automatically reinforce the story. Because sometimes what keeps a pattern alive is not belief alone. It is participation. And once that becomes visible, something shifts in how you see conversations like these. Not into judgment, but into awareness of how easily emotional identities can form between people without anyone realizing they are building them together. And maybe the most unsettling realization is not about who is the victim or who is the observer. It is how quickly any of us can begin to rely on emotional narratives that feel true enough to stop questioning. Until one day you find yourself wondering whether the story you keep returning to is describing your life or quietly shaping it. And once that question appears, it doesn't really leave in the same way again.